The galaxy had forgotten silence. For 600 years, the stars themselves trembled under endless bombardment, Velker warships slicing through the void against the burning crimson fleets of the Tsar Collective. The war had outlived its reasons. It was now a habit written into the blood of two civilizations. Planets that had once sung with life were now cold ash drifting in forgotten orbit. Commander Kor Velkin stood at the viewport of the dreadnought Vigilant Sphere, watching the ruin of Delta Prime fade behind them, his reflection etched against the embers of another lost world. Kor's scales were dulled with age, each scar a reminder that peace was a myth for weaker species. The Velker had long since stopped counting their dead. So had the Tsar. The war machine kept turning because it no longer knew how to stop. But even war has rhythms, and in the quiet between campaigns, Kor felt an emptiness that strategy could not fill. He found himself asking questions that had no place in a soldier's mind, questions about what waited at the end of 6 centuries of blood. The quiet fractured when his communications officer barked for attention. Unidentified object in proximity to Sector 14B, small. No power signature. Kor frowned. Debris was common, but the officer's tone carried unease. Visual feed. The screen flickered, revealing a derelict craft tumbling through the debris field. It was small, roughly the size of an escape pod, yet its hull bore symbols, neither Velker nor Tsar. Primitive lines, hand-carved emblems, metal that predated modern alloys. The bridge fell silent as they examined it, every officer waiting for Kor's command. "Retrieve it," Kor ordered finally. "If it's our tech, I want to know. If it's something else, I want to know faster." A recovery team boarded the pod within the hour. They transmitted back visuals, narrow corridors lined with frost, air thick with age. Then came the voice of the lead scout, tight with disbelief. "Commander, there's a body inside. Still intact." Kor leaned closer to the screen. The camera panned to reveal a chamber of ancient design. In the center floated a cryostasis capsule, half buried in ice. Within it lay a creature unlike any species catalogued by Velker science. Smooth-skinned, pale, features angular and soft. 2 eyes, a short jawline, no visible scales or armor. The body was clothed in a dark uniform bearing faded markings, 3 interlocking rings encircling a blue sphere. "What species is that?" Kor asked. "Unknown, sir. The pod predates any record we possess." The words carried a strange weight. 6 centuries of total war had left no room for the unknown. Every star, every species, every relic had been claimed or burned. To find something new was like finding a whisper in the middle of a scream. Kor ordered the pod brought aboard and transferred it to Research Bay 9 under full containment. As he followed the procession down the metallic corridors, he found himself staring at the figure through the capsule's frost. The being looked fragile. No armor, no weapon, no augmentations. Yet something about its posture, even in sleep, suggested defiance. Its hand was clenched around a metal tag worn close to its chest. The inscription was ancient, but legible. United Earth Expeditionary Force, Captain Elias Grant. The research team gathered quickly, led by Dr. Taryn Vell, a sharp-featured biologist whose voice trembled with excitement. "The DNA profile is unlike anything we've ever sequenced. It's carbon-based but extraordinarily dense. Skeletal structure suggests gravity adaptation far beyond our own tolerances. Commander, this creature evolved for war environments harsher than ours." "Revive it," Kor said. Taryn hesitated. "Sir, the system is ancient. We risk damaging the specimen." Kor's tone turned cold. "We've destroyed 1,000 worlds, Doctor. One more risk will not end the galaxy." Within minutes, the cryoseals released with a hiss that echoed through the chamber. Frost spilled over the floor. The being's chest convulsed once, twice, then drew a deep breath that cut through the silence. Alarms flared as temperature and oxygen levels spiked. The creature's eyes opened, gray, sharp, and far too human in their focus. For a moment, no one moved. The alien, no, the man, sat up slowly, disoriented but calm. His gaze swept the room, assessing every exit, every face, every weapon. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep, controlled, and carried a strange authority that silenced even the war-hardened Velker soldiers. "Where's the rest of the fleet?" Kor stepped forward, unable to mask his curiosity. "Fleet? You were found adrift near Delta Prime. You're the only survivor." The man blinked, confusion shadowing his expression. "Impossible. The UEF never abandons its own." "UEF?" Terran echoed softly. "United Earth Expeditionary Force," the man said. "Exploration Division. Mission to the Orion Gate. We hit enemy fire." He stopped, scanning their faces, and something in their alien features made him pause. "You're not them," he whispered. Kor inclined his head. "You are aboard a Velker Dominion vessel. The Orion Gate collapsed centuries ago. You've been asleep for a long time." "How long?" 600 years. The man exhaled sharply. For a heartbeat, his composure faltered. Then his jaw set, and his eyes hardened with soldier's resolve. "Then humanity is gone." No one spoke. Even the machines seemed to pause. Kor studied him, uneasy. There was no grief in the human's tone, only a cold certainty that carried the weight of entire civilizations buried in memory. The human rose to his feet, ignoring the guards' drawn weapons. He moved with deliberate precision, body language that radiated command. "You're fighting a war," he said, more statement than question. Kor nodded. "The Dominion and the Tsar. It has lasted beyond living memory." "Why?" The simplicity of the question caught Kor off guard. He hesitated. "It began with resource disputes. Now it continues because it always has." The human regarded him for a long time, then said quietly, "Then you've already lost." Kor felt the words like a blade between his ribs. There was no threat in the human's tone, yet it carried the finality of judgment. The man turned his gaze toward the viewport, where the faint glow of distant war zones flickered against the black. "War without reason," he murmured. "We had one of those once." "And what happened?" Kor asked before he could stop himself. The human looked over his shoulder, eyes dark with something unspoken. "We ended it. But not before it ended us first." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with questions no one dared ask. The cryo chamber lights dimmed, and outside the viewport, the stars stretched into streaks as the dreadnought slipped into warp. Kor watched the human's reflection, standing tall, still, like a memory the universe itself had tried to forget, and wondered if the war had just met its reckoning. The research bay had been sealed for 3 rotations, its atmosphere sterilized, its light dimmed to mimic human tolerances. Yet nothing about the space felt secure. Every Velker scientist stationed there understood instinctively that their guest was not a subject of study, but a force of nature waiting for purpose. Captain Elias Grant sat within the transparent containment field, silent and immovable, his gaze fixed on the shimmering stars beyond the viewport. He had refused food for an entire cycle, though his body showed no sign of fatigue. The alien technicians whispered among themselves that perhaps he fed on fear. Dr. Terran Vel entered the chamber with a datapad clutched tight to his chest. He had been given strict orders to understand the physiology of this human, to measure its capabilities, to categorize its biology for the Dominion's records. Yet as the days passed, Terran found his curiosity eroding into something more like reverence. The human's blood resisted analysis. His neural readings spiked off the chart whenever the war outside was mentioned. He was, by every known metric, an impossibility. "You're avoiding my questions again," Terran said carefully, activating the translator field. Elias didn't look at him. "You're asking the wrong ones." The alien scientist hesitated. "Then what are the right ones, Captain?" Elias turned his head, and Terran felt the weight of that steady, human gaze. "Ask what happens when a species learns war before it learns peace." The statement lingered between them, heavy as gravity. Terran had studied hundreds of sentient races, but he had never encountered one that spoke of war as though it were a teacher. He gathered his composure, tapping at the datapad. "Our civilizations have been at war for 6 centuries. We understand conflict well enough. Elias gave a dry, humorless laugh.
No.
You understand fighting. War is something else. War is when every child knows what loss tastes like before they can speak. When your history books become eulogies. Terran wanted to object, but something in the man's tone silenced him. It wasn't bravado. It was memory. Commander Corvell entered then, his towering frame cutting a sharp silhouette against the sterile lights. The guard stiffened as he approached, though the human barely glanced up. Cor had spent his life mastering intimidation, yet this unarmed creature met his stare with the composure of a predator that had already decided the outcome. We've confirmed your story, Cor began. The Orion Gate collapsed in what our historians call the First Silence. Your vessel's design predates the earliest Dominion records. You are, by all measures, an anachronism. Elias folded his hands, the faintest smirk touching his lips. Then I suppose that makes me your oldest soldier. Cor ignored the attempt at levity. You said your people fought a great war once. Against whom? Elias's expression hardened. Ourselves. A flicker of confusion crossed Cor's face. You destroyed your own kind? Elias nodded slowly. Over land, over belief, over pride. For thousands of years we killed each other in new and creative ways. We perfected destruction until it nearly erased us. That's when we learned to stop. Terran frowned. How do you stop something that defines you? By remembering what it costs, Elias said. His gaze drifted toward the containment field's barrier, eyes unfocused, lost in a memory only he could see. We burned cities so bright they turned night into day. We built weapons that could unmake oceans. Then, when the smoke cleared, there was nothing left worth owning. That's when we buried the idea of war. Cor studied him carefully. And yet you wear a soldier's uniform. Elias looked down at the faded insignia on his chest. Some lessons need to be remembered, not repeated. The commander's mandibles flexed, a gesture of contemplation among the Velker. You speak as if your people were gods who learned remorse. Elias smiled faintly. We weren't gods. Just men who finally realized they were never immortal. Terran felt a strange shiver at that. The human's words carried a weight that defied translation, something primal, ancient, and deeply personal. For the first time, he wondered whether this man's awakening was accident or fate. Outside the observation window, the endless war continued. Even here, light from distant explosions shimmered across the hull. The sound of the ship's engines thrummed beneath their feet, a constant reminder that no place was truly still in this universe. Cor turned his gaze toward the viewport, his reflection merging with the humans. You've seen our war, he said quietly. You know it cannot stop. It is the only truth left to us. Elias stood, stepping close to the transparent barrier. For a heartbeat, his shadow fell across Cor's reflection. You're wrong, he said. War isn't a truth. It's an addiction. And like all addictions, it ends when you've destroyed everything else you could lose. Cor felt a flicker of anger, not at the words, but at the conviction behind them. You think your kind's superior? You think humans ended war because of wisdom? Elias's reply came like steel.
No.
We ended it because we ran out of graves. The commander said nothing. The hum of the engines filled the silence. When Cor finally spoke, his tone had softened, almost reluctantly. The Dominion Council will want to question you. They believe your knowledge may end this conflict, or escalate it. You'll be transferred to Theta Command tomorrow. Elias nodded once, unafraid. Then tell them to decide what they're fighting for before they ask how to win. Cor turned to leave, but paused at the doorway. What did your people call themselves, Captain? Elias met his gaze evenly. Humans. The word echoed through the chamber like a pulse. Terran found himself repeating it under his breath, tasting its unfamiliar syllables. Humans, there was something resolute in it, something elemental. He realized, with a faint chill, that it sounded less like a species name and more like a warning. Later, when the lights dimmed to simulate rest cycles, Terran returned alone. The human was still awake, staring at the stars as though they were old friends. You spoke earlier of memory, Terran said softly. What happens to those who forget? Elias's voice was calm, almost kind. They start wars they can't remember how to end. The scientist nodded slowly, understanding far more than he wished to. Behind the glass, the human's breath fogged the barrier for just a moment before fading away. Terran wondered what kind of world could create a man like this, and what kind of galaxy would survive meeting him again. Outside, the distant explosions ceased for a brief instant, as though the universe itself had paused to listen. The stillness lasted only a second before the engines roared back to life, carrying them toward a future that felt suddenly uncertain. Terran couldn't shake the thought that the real war, the one that mattered, had just begun, and it wasn't the Dominion or the Tsar who would decide how it ended. It would be the human, the relic from a vanished Earth, who would teach them all what kind of peace must be earned through fear. The council chamber of Theta Command was a cathedral of war. Black metal, flickering holograms, and the constant low hum of orbiting fleets waiting for orders. Commander Corvell stood beside the containment field where Captain Elias Grant waited, his hands clasped behind his back. Around them, representatives from both the Velker Dominion and the Tsar Collective gathered in uneasy silence. The temporary ceasefire was fragile, enforced only by curiosity and a shared fear of what this lone human might reveal. For the first time in centuries, enemies stood in the same room without weapons raised. Elias surveyed them with the steady composure of a man long accustomed to command. His eyes moved over the sharp forms of the Velker, tall, armored, reptilian, and the insectoid Tsar, whose carapaces shimmered like obsidian glass. The alien faces were unfamiliar, but the tension was ancient. Every room of soldiers smelled the same: sweat, suspicion, and pride. A Velker dignitary broke the silence. Human, we summoned you to explain yourself. The Dominion and the Collective have fought for generations beyond memory. You claim your species once ended war. Then teach us how. Elias's gaze held the speaker for a long moment before he replied. You think peace is something you can be taught? Peace isn't a skill. It's a scar. The murmur that followed rippled through the hall like static. Kor watched closely, his instincts prickling. The man's words carried a gravity that bent the room around them. Elias took a step forward, the containment barrier dissolving at Kor's silent command. He walked into the center of the chamber, the lights casting harsh shadows across his face. When I was a soldier, he began, we thought ourselves righteous. Every war begins that way. We called our enemies monsters because it made the killing easier. We built weapons that could erase continents, and we used them. We didn't stop because we found mercy. We stopped because there was nothing left to save. The Tsar representative shifted uneasily, his voice a rasping click. You destroyed your world and call it wisdom? Elias looked up at the alien, his expression unreadable. We call it memory, the kind that hurts enough to last. Kor felt the weight of those words pressing against the walls. He had seen entire civilizations consumed in the name of conquest, yet he realized he had never once considered what would come after victory. What would be left to rule if everything worth ruling was already ash? Elias continued, his voice steady but low. You've fought for 6 centuries without knowing why. You've turned war into culture, destruction into religion. I've seen what that makes of people. It hollows you until the only thing you know is the sound of your own rage. One of the Tsar's soldiers hissed. We fight to survive. The human turned sharply, eyes blazing. So did we. But survival means nothing when you forget what you're surviving for. The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the humming machinery seemed to fade. The alien delegates shifted, their body language uncertain, their collective arrogance thinning beneath the human's words. Dr. Terran Vell, standing at the edge of the chamber, watched the scene with growing awe. He had studied logic his entire life, but this was something else. The human was not persuading them through intellect or dominance. He was infecting them with something older, emotion, guilt, the unbearable weight of conscience. Elias walked slowly toward the central holoprojector and placed a hand against its surface. Images of burning worlds flickered to life, the record of the Dominion Tsar War. Cities shattered, children buried under metallic dust, oceans turned to poison. "You call this victory," he said quietly. "But it's only momentum. You're trapped in the same loop that consumed us." Kor's throat felt tight. "You said your people stopped it."
How?
Elias looked up at him, and in his eyes burned the reflection of every lost civilization. "By realizing there are no victors. By understanding that if you bury your enemy long enough, you start digging your own grave." The room trembled as the ship outside shuddered from a distant explosion, one of many still echoing through nearby systems. The ceasefire was already fraying. Both factions would soon return to their fleets, ready to resume the endless slaughter. Elias turned toward the sound, then back to the assembly. "I can't make you stop," he said. "No one could make us stop either. But I can show you at a cost." Kor frowned.
Show us.
The human closed his eyes, his breathing slow and deliberate. The translators detected a sudden surge of electromagnetic interference, a spike in cognitive resonance. The empathic receptors of both alien species flared uncontrollably, linking minds for a fraction of a second. And in that instant, every being in the chamber saw what Elias carried in his memory. They saw skies burning over a blue planet. They saw the flash of 1,000 suns consuming oceans, cities, and faces that vanished before they could scream. They saw men tearing at each other's throats over ashes, soldiers shooting at shadows, because there was nothing left to conquer. They felt the heat of a dying world and the hollow silence that followed when victory meant extinction. When the vision ended, several Tsar delegates collapsed, trembling. One Velker officer tore the insignia from his chest and threw it aside. Terran fell to his knees, gasping, his mind filled with ghosts that were not his own. Kor, though reeling, remained standing. His voice came hoarse and low. "You carry that memory every day." Elias opened his eyes. "Someone has to." The council chamber was utterly silent. No one dared speak. For the first time in centuries, no one argued, no one ordered, no one planned the next battle. Elias looked around the room, at the soldiers, the leaders, the killers, and said, "The universe doesn't need another species like us. Learn from our ending before it becomes yours." Kor took a slow step forward. "If what you say is true, then perhaps there is still a choice." Elias nodded once. "There's always a choice. The hard part is living with it." The sound of his voice lingered as he turned away, leaving the council in stunned silence. Outside the viewport, the fleets that had been poised for battle drifted in hesitation. The Tsar warship formation dimmed, its targeting arrays. The Velker dreadnoughts held position. Across both sides of the war front, a ripple of confusion spread, an unspoken command to stand down, if only for a heartbeat. Kor watched it happen, his chest tightening with something he had never felt before, hope laced with terror. He looked back at the human, who now stood at the window gazing into the endless dark. "What will you do now?" Kor asked quietly. Elias's reflection flickered in the glass. "What humans always do," he said. "Try to build something out of the ruins." And for a moment, just a moment, the stars outside seemed to burn a little less fiercely, as if the galaxy itself were holding its breath, waiting to see if the impossible could truly begin. Weeks passed, and the war that had once devoured entire galaxies remained eerily quiet. The ceasefire, once expected to crumble within hours, stretched into days, then weeks. Fleet commanders who had lived their entire lives by the rhythm of destruction found themselves adrift in the stillness. Reports flooded in from every sector. Tsar war machines powered down, Velker fortresses stood dormant, and entire armadas waited in silence for orders that no one dared to give. The stars, for the first time in centuries, reflected light instead of fire. Captain Elias Grant became an unspoken legend among both sides. His image circulated across Dominion and collective channels, half myth, half prophet. The words he had spoken in the council chamber spread faster than any weapon could travel. Some called him the ghost of Earth. Others whispered that he was a god in mortal flesh, a being resurrected to judge the living. But those who had met him knew the truth. He was only a man, and somehow that made his presence all the more terrifying. On the observation deck of the Vigilant Sphere, Commander Cor Vel stood beside Dr. Terran Vel, watching the human as he worked silently over a holographic map of the Orion Gate system. Elias had taken no rank, given no orders. Yet men obeyed him. His authority came not from power, but from conviction, an invisible gravity that drew every eye when he entered a room. Cor finally broke the silence.
They listen to you, he said. Both sides.
They watch you as if you hold the universe's pulse in your hand. Elias didn't look up. They listen because they're afraid. Fear is always the first step toward understanding. And the second?
Terran asked.
Elias adjusted the hologram until a single blue planet appeared, Earth, reconstructed from half-corrupted data fragments. Memory, he said softly. If they remember what peace feels like, even for a moment, they might fight to keep it. Cor studied him quietly.
What about you?
You remember war more clearly than anyone alive. That's why I can't stay. Elias's tone was calm, but the words carried weight. I'm a relic of what they were. My existence reminds them of what they fear becoming again. Terran stepped closer, his voice almost pleading. You brought them peace. You could guide it. Elias finally turned to face them. His expression was weary but resolute. Peace guided by a soldier isn't peace. It's just waiting for the next command. For a long moment, none of them spoke. Outside the viewport, the glow of the Orion Gate shimmered faintly, rebuilt by Dominion engineers, not as a weapon but as a monument. Its reconstructed arch bore an inscription in both languages, in the memory of all who forgot why they fought. The idea had been Elias's, though he had never taken credit. A soft chime interrupted them. A message had arrived from the Joint Council. Cor opened the transmission, reading it silently before looking up.
They've signed it, he said.
The Armistice Charter. Dominion and Collective. It's done. The words seemed almost too fragile to speak aloud. 6 centuries of war, ended by a single human memory. Terran's throat tightened as he watched Elias lower his gaze, his eyes shadowed with something close to sorrow. Then my work's finished, Elias murmured. Cor frowned. What will you do?
Go home, the human said.
Or what's left of it? There's nothing there, Terran said quietly. Earth is gone. The records. I know. Elias's lips curved faintly. That's the point. Some ghosts deserve to rest where they began.
Cor's voice deepened.
You're choosing exile. Elias met his gaze.
No.
I'm choosing silence. The final preparations were made, without ceremony. A small transport was retrofitted for deep space travel and provisioned for one occupant. No one could dissuade him. By the time the fleets gathered to watch his departure, he was already aboard, seated in the pilot's chair of a ship smaller than the one that had carried him into cryosleep centuries before. Terran stood beside Cor on the deck as the ship disengaged from the hangar clamps. Do you think he'll survive the journey? He asked. Cor shook his head slowly. He survived the end of humanity. Survival isn't his problem. The ship's engines ignited, cutting through the void with a streak of silver light. The assembled fleets, Velker and Zar alike, stood in reverent silence. Across every comm channel, a single transmission echoed. Elias's voice carried through the static. Asterisk, remember what it cost. Asterisk. That message repeated once, then faded forever. Days later, Terran visited the Council Memorial Hall, where a single insignia rested on a pedestal beneath the reconstructed Earth emblem. The tag was old, tarnished, its engraved letters nearly worn away. UAF. Captain Elias Grant below it. The Council had added a new inscription in both tongues. He ended the war by reminding us we were still alive. Cor joined him there, his armor gleaming under the soft lights. Do you believe he was truly human? Terran asked quietly. Cor's eyes lingered on the insignia. I think it doesn't matter. He believed he was, and that was enough to make us see what we had forgotten. Outside, the galaxy moved on. Trade routes reopened, Border defenses fell silent, and for the first time in generations, young soldiers were trained not for battle, but for rebuilding. Yet the story of the humans spread faster than any ship could travel. Children spoke his name in both alien tongues, priests whispered it in temples, and scholars debated whether he had been man or myth. Far beyond the reach of any signal, a lone vessel drifted through the quiet between stars. Inside, Captain Elias Grant sat at the cockpit, his hands resting on the controls, though the ship needed no guidance. The stars ahead stretched like silver threads across the black. His face was calm, the exhaustion of centuries softened by the faintest trace of peace. He reached into his pocket and withdrew the small metal tag he had once carried over his heart. Turning it over in his fingers, he whispered, "You can rest now." Then he closed his eyes and leaned back as the ship slipped silently into the darkness. Back on Theta Command, in the wake of his departure, an uneasy peace settled over the galaxy. Armies disbanded, monuments rose, and across the stars, two species that had once known only blood began to speak of unity. Yet sometimes, when the space between suns grew too quiet, soldiers claimed they could still hear an echo in the static, an old human voice whispering through the void. Asterisk, the war ended when they saw a human. Asterisk. And whenever they did, even the most battle-hardened of them lowered their weapons and listened.